Imagine for a moment that everything you think you are, your body, your moods, your racing thoughts, even your cherished opinions about yourself, imagine all of that is not actually you at all. Imagine it's just clothing, just tools, just instruments lying on a workbench, waiting for someone to pick them up and use them properly. Now imagine that the one who is supposed to pick them up, the real operator behind your eyes, has been asleep this whole time, mistaking the tools for the worker, mistaking the clothing for the body underneath. What would happen if that sleeper woke up? That is a question this book asks. And by the end of this video, you will have walked through an entire century-old system designed to answer it. A system that claims you can consciously separate yourself from your body, master your own emotions like a driver holds the reins a horse, direct your own subconscious mind to solve problems while you sleep, and awaken to a sense of identity so vast that the boundary between you and the universe itself begins to dissolve. Stay with me through this one, because we're going to go the entire distance, all 12 lessons, and by the end you will never think about the 3 little letters, I, the same way again. Let's talk for a moment about where this material comes from. In the early 1900s, a series of lessons began circulating under the name Yogi Ramacharaka, published monthly starting in October 1905 and running through September the following year. They were gathered together into a single volume that became known simply as Raja Yoga or Mental Development. The author positioned himself as a translator and teacher of ideas drawn from Indian spiritual philosophy, reframed for a Western audience hungry for psychology of the soul. Whatever you believe about the origins of these teachings, what matters for us today is the content itself. A structured, step-by-step course meant to walk a student, called throughout the candidate, from the most basic realization of self all the way up through mastery of attention, perception, the unconscious mind, and character itself. The book doesn't waste time on a big theoretical preamble. It drops you straight into the deep end with the very first lesson, and so will we. Chapter 1, The I. The whole book begins with a scene. In India, the text tells us, when a candidate approaches a teacher asking to be initiated into Raja Yoga, that candidate is not handed a set of physical exercises or a reading list. They are handed a single, deceptively simple task. Discover who you actually are, not intellectually, not as a clever definition you could recite at a dinner party, but as a felt-lived, undeniable realization. Until that realization takes hold, the teachers refuse to move forward because they insist that a person who does not know where their own power originates cannot possibly learn to wield the will, which is described as the very engine underneath the entire practice of Raja Yoga. There are, according to this teaching, 2 degrees of awakening. The first is called the consciousness of the I, a felt certainty that you are a real, continuing entity whose existence is not simply a side effect of your body, and which will continue even after the body falls away. The second, deeper stage is called the consciousness of the I am, a recognition of your oneness with universal life itself, and in touchness with everything that exists, expressed or not yet expressed. Some people stumble into these realizations suddenly, like a flash of lightning. Others have to work toward them steadily, brick by brick. Either way, the text insists, these 2 stages eventually come to anyone who seriously walks the path. To set the stage, the lesson offers a sweeping picture of what a human being actually is. We are, we're told, a strange composite creature. In our bones and blood, we share something with the mineral world. In our physical life and growth, we resemble plants. In our appetites and instincts, we resemble the animals below us. And yet, we also carry mental faculties unique to our kind. And beyond even those faculties that are only beginning to unfold the more awakened among us, faculties that, when they do unfold, make a person more than merely human in the ordinary sense. And underlying all is the will, described as the birthright of the ego, inherited directly from the absolute source of all things. But here's the key move the lesson makes, and it's worth sitting with. All of these things, the mental faculties, the physical body, even the will's expression, belong to us. They are not us. Before a person can properly use these tools, they first have to wake up to themselves as the one holding the tools. They have to learn to distinguish the I from everything that is not I. What is this real self, then? The text describes it almost poetically. A divine spark thrown off from a sacred flame. A child of a divine parent. Immortal, eternal, indestructible, invincible. Like an infant unaware of the adult it will one day become. Our own minds are largely unaware of the latent, potential majesty already folded up inside them. As that awakening happens, layer after layer of false identification gets peeled back and set aside until only the true, naked self remains. And then, only then, a person returns to make proper use of things they had cast off, to understand what most people mean when they say, I. The lesson takes us on a little evolutionary tour. Lower animals, we're told, never developed a sense of I at all. They're aware of hunger, of the outside world, of pleasure and pain, but they cannot step back and reflect on themselves as separate entities. Savages and undeveloped humans are barely a step above this. Their sense of self is almost entirely wrapped up with bodily wants, appetites, and physical comfort. If you asked a person at that stage of development what their I was, they would essentially describe their body having certain feelings, wants, and desires. And here's an uncomfortable observation the book makes. Plenty of so-called civilized people never really progress past this stage either. They may have sharpened their thinking abilities, but they use those abilities purely in service of bodily cravings, what we often proudly call culture and refinement. The lesson suggests is frequently nothing more than a more sophisticated version of sense gratification, dressed up to look like spiritual advancement. As a person climbs higher, they begin to identify with their mind rather than their body. They start reasoning, questioning, philosophizing, and here a strange thing happens. The deeper they go into pure intellectual inquiry, the more unanswerable questions seem to multiply in front of them. This is where pessimism tends to set in. The lesson tells us, because a mind operating purely on the intellectual plane, disconnected from the deeper knowing beneath it, keeps bumping into walls it cannot see past. The person on this plane is compared to a powerful elephant that doesn't yet know its own strength, capable of extraordinary things, but instead cowed by a small handler or startled by the rustle of a piece of paper, simply because it has never grasped what it actually is. The breakthrough comes when a person crosses from the purely mental plane onto what the lesson calls the spiritual plane. Here, for the first time, a person recognizes that the I is something higher than either body or mind, that both are simply tools available for its use. This recognition doesn't usually arrive through cold logical argument. It arrives as a felt awareness, a new category of consciousness altogether. Once a person has crossed this threshold, they are, in the language of the lesson, no longer merely a candidate. They have become an initiate. So, how does a person actually get there? The lesson doesn't leave us with vague inspiration. It gives concrete instructions. The first tool it offers is something called a state of meditation. Find a quiet place where you won't be disturbed. Sit or lie comfortably. Let every muscle go loose. Let every nerve unclench until a feeling of calm settles over your entire body. This isn't meant to become some permanent, dreamy detachment from ordinary life. The lesson is quite firm that the state of meditation should always remain under the deliberate control of the will, entered into on purpose and exited on purpose. Never allow to become an excuse for drifting through your responsibilities in a fog. Once in this relaxed state, the first real exercise is what we might call the realization of the I. You picture yourself quite deliberately as a genuine center around which your entire world revolves, not out of arrogance and not as comparison to anyone else's worth, but simply as a fact of your nature as a center of consciousness created directly by the Absolute. You are invited to sit with the phrase, I am a center of consciousness, influence, and power, letting it sink in not as words repeated by rote, but as a truth felt in the body. The lesson offers a striking thought experiment here. It points out that no matter how humble your circumstances, no matter how difficult your life, you would never actually agree to trade your own identity for someone else's, even if that other person seemed to have everything you wanted. What you actually want, when you say you wish you were someone else, is some quality they possess, their wealth, their talent, their position, not literally to stop being yourself and become them, because becoming them would mean the extinguishing of your own I. And something in you recoils from that idea instantly and absolutely. This, the lesson argues, is itself proof that your I is something real, continuous, and precious to you at the deepest level. Something that has carried you from your childhood self all the way to who you are today, through every change, remaining recognizable you the entire time. The lesson even mentions the poet Tennyson as an example of someone who stumbled onto a related practice on his own, repeating his own name slowly and solemnly during quiet meditation, and reportedly experiencing a vivid awareness of his own reality and immortality as a result. Next comes an exercise designed to address a very specific stumbling block, the tendency to confuse the reality of the I with the physical body. Here you're guided to imagine yourself as independent of your body, using it the way you might use a suit of clothes or a house you happen to be living in temporarily. You picture yourself capable of leaving that body behind and still remaining exactly who you are. This isn't meant to encourage you to neglect or disrespect your physical form. Quite the opposite. The lesson insists you should treat your body as a temple worthy of care, simply not worthy of mistaken identity. Then there's an exercise concerning immortality, and it's genuinely clever. Try, right now, to imagine yourself as dead, not your body lying still. That part is easy to picture, but try to imagine the actual experiencing you as non-existent. According to the lesson, you will find this strictly impossible. Every time you try, you discover that you are still standing there, watching the dead body, still very much present as an observer. The mind, it turns out, simply refuses to entertain its own non-existence. And this refusal is offered as a kind of built-in, self-evident proof of the soul's immortality. Not a philosophical argument, but a direct experience available to anyone willing to actually try the exercise. Finally, the lesson walks through visualizations of invincibility, imagining the I, withdrawn from the body, passing safely through fire, through water, through open air untouched, because these are properties of the physical world. And the physical world simply cannot reach or harm the true self behind it. The chapter closes with real warmth. urging the reader not to be discouraged by slow progress, promising that whatever ground is gained on this path is never truly lost, only sometimes paused. And it leaves the student with a set of short affirmations to carry forward, simple statements like, I am a center, around me revolves my world, and I am immortal and cannot be destroyed. Chapter 2, The Ego's Mental Tools. Having established the reality of the I apart from the body, the second lesson goes further, and this is where things get genuinely tricky, because now we have to separate the I from something far more intimate and convincing than the body, the mind itself. The lesson lays out 3 layers or principles of mind that most people never think to distinguish. First comes the instinctive mind, which we share with animals. This is the oldest layer, responsible for keeping the body running, digestion, repair, the automatic housekeeping of being alive, all handled below the level of conscious awareness. But this same layer also stores something else, the accumulated residue of ancient animal instincts, old fighting reflexes, primal hungers, jealousy, envy, all the leftover furniture from earlier, more primitive stages of existence. The lesson describes this region of the mind vividly as a queer storehouse holding a strange mixture of the very useful and the very much like junk and rubbish, still capable of surfacing under pressure even in people who believe they've long outgrown such things. And it's careful to note something important here. None of this is inherently bad. These instincts served real purposes in the past, and some still do. The problem only arises when a person is mastered by them, rather than the other way around. Above the instinctive mind sits the intellect, the faculty of reasoning, analyzing, and thinking that most people understandably mistake for their entire mental identity. And above even that sits what the lesson calls the spiritual mind, the wellspring of genius, inspiration, true religious feeling, kindness, justice, and unselfish love. This is the source of humanity's highest ideas and its capacity for realizing spiritual truths like the very I consciousness described in the first lesson. But here's the crucial twist. Even this highest, most refined layer of mind, the spiritual mind itself, is still, in the end, only a tool. A remarkably fine tool, yes, but a tool nonetheless, belonging to the ego rather than constituting it. To make this concrete, the lesson offers what it calls a mental drill, and it's genuinely one of the most interesting exercises in the whole book. You start with the physical sensations closest to the body: hunger, thirst, pain, pleasure. Advanced students, the lesson notes, have already learned to hold these at arm's length, thinking my body is hungry rather than I am hungry, the same way you might notice your dog whining for its dinner. Then you move on to the emotions: anger, love, jealousy, ambition, and you practice examining each one the way you might examine an object on a table, turning it over, watching where it came from and where it goes, recognizing that the very fact you can observe an emotion proves it cannot be the same thing as the observer. Then, remarkably, the lesson pushes this process even into the intellect itself. You can hold your own reasoning processes up for inspection. Study them the way you would study a science textbook, classify them, dissect them, and finally, even into the spiritual mind, the source of your loftiest inspirations. Even those thoughts can be examined and considered as objects, meaning they too belong in the category of not I. So what's left after you've set aside the body, the emotions, the intellect, and even your highest spiritual insights? The lesson's answer is almost playful in its simplicity. Try to set aside that I itself, the very one doing all this examining, and you will find it flatly impossible. You may set aside every mental quality you possess, one after another, but the one doing the setting aside can never itself become the object being set aside. You cannot, the text says, have the sun shine upon itself by its own light. And so, at the very bottom of this whole process of elimination, something remains that refuses to be examined from the outside, because it is always the examiner, never the examined. All that consciousness can report about this remaining I is a bare, simple fact. I am. Nothing more elaborate is available, and nothing more elaborate is needed. The lesson brings in a lengthy passage from the writer Edward Carpenter, describing his encounter with a Hindu teacher, arguing that just as we would remove an uncomfortable pebble from our shoe without hesitation, we ought to be equally capable of expelling an unwanted, tormenting thought from our mind. Once we properly understand that the mind is a tool a master workman sets down when the job is finished, rather than something we are forced to carry everywhere out of ignorance of how to put it away. The chapter ends by promising that the next lesson will expand this newly awakened sense of I outward, from a small personal identity into something touching a whole existence. And that is exactly where we're headed next. Chapter 3. The expansion of the self. This third lesson opens with an important warning, and it's one the author clearly felt strongly about. There is seductive but dangerous teaching floating around certain spiritual circles. The lesson says, which claims that the individual person literally is God, full stop, and that the entire visible universe is nothing but an illusion, a kind of divine daydream that a bored absolute concocted purely to entertain itself. The lesson doesn't hold back its criticism here, describing this idea as leading people into a passive, negative, defeated mental state. Since if everything is illusion and nothing is truly real, then there's nothing left to actually do or strive toward. The lesson wants absolutely no part of that conclusion. Instead, it proposes something more careful. You are not God. You are, in the lesson's words, a child of the Absolute, carrying within you a divine heritage whose mission is to unfold qualities inherited from that parent. This is a subtle but important distinction. You are a genuine, real, individual expression of the One, not an illusory costume the One is wearing to amuse itself. And yet, having drawn that careful line, the lesson still wants to expand your sense of what you actually are, far beyond the small, isolated personality most of us carry around day to day. It walks through the layers of the physical universe, matter, energy, and mind, and shows how each one, traced back far enough, dissolves into a deeper unity. Matter, at its root, is nothing but an extremely fine, subtle substance the lesson calls akasa or ether. Trace matter back far enough, and it becomes indistinguishable from energy. Trace energy back far enough, and it shades into mind itself, the universal mind substance from which every individual thought is drawn and to which it eventually returns. The lesson uses a lovely image here. Imagine the ego moving forward through vast oceans of matter, energy, and mind, drawing what it needs from each ocean as it passes through, then leaving that portion behind as it continues on its way. The only thing that is truly, permanently yours in this whole process is the ego itself. Everything else is borrowed from a common, universal supply and eventually returned to that same supply. This leads into a genuinely stirring section on the oneness of life itself. The lesson insists there is nothing dead anywhere in the universe. Every atom, every particle, carries within it some trace of life and intelligence, however faint. Rather than being isolated sparks of life floating in a sea of lifelessness, we are, the lesson says, atoms of life surrounded by an ocean of life. Everything pulsating, thinking, alive. The lesson then offers a set of guided visualizations meant to help a student actually feel this oneness, rather than merely believe it intellectually. You're invited to meditate on the underlying unity of matter, then of energy, then of mind, gradually seeing behind the countless different forms to the single underlying substance beneath them all. Then you're guided to feel your kinship with all forms of life, from the humblest speck to the most magnificent star, letting your sense of self expand outward until, instead of feeling small next to the vastness of the universe, you begin to feel that the universe itself is your home, not a place you're merely passing through, but somewhere you genuinely belong in every corner of it. The lesson is careful to note that this expanding sense of identity brings with it something essential: love and kindness toward all living things. Because of the growing will that comes with this expanded consciousness were not accompanied by greater compassion, it could become genuinely dangerous, used selfishly, the way certain misguided figures throughout history have used personal power without the wisdom to guide it properly, but properly understood and properly walked. This path brings power and love together, each one strengthening the other. The lesson closes with short, memorable line borrowed from a commentary on a classic spiritual text, describing the fragile, precious moment of glimpsing your own higher nature for the first time, and the discipline required to keep gazing at that inner light steadily, without flinching or looking away in fear. Chapter 4, Mental Control, with the foundation laid. The fourth lesson turns to practical mastery, and it opens by reviewing exactly what the previous 3 lessons established. First, the reality of the I, independent of and superior to the body. Second, the reality of the I as master of the mind rather than a mere bundle of mental states. Third, the vast universal nature of that same I, rooted in the absolute itself. Now the lesson lays out a hierarchy. Matter is described as the lowest, grossest form of manifestation, subordinate to energy. Energy in turn is subordinate to mind, and mind, the finest and highest of the 3, is nevertheless still subordinate to the I, which is pure spirit. Only the I itself answers to something higher still, the absolute, the very center of being. This is where the lesson introduces a beautifully compact motto for the student to adopt. I am positive to mind, energy, and matter, meaning I have authority over them and can direct them by my will. And I am negative only to the absolute, meaning I gladly submit myself to that highest source, opening myself to receive its power, strength, and wisdom. The lesson takes a moment to clarify some vocabulary that can get genuinely confusing. The word mind gets used in 2 different senses throughout these teachings. Sometimes it refers to chit, the universal mind substance from which all personal minds draw their material, the way water might be drawn from an ocean. Other times mind refers to a specific person's own mental furniture, their instinctive mind, intellect, and spiritual mind together, which combine to form what we might call the soul of that individual, a term the lesson distinguishes carefully from spirit, which refers only to the innermost I, the soul. Raja Yoga's basic principle, the lesson declares plainly, is to control the mind before a person can hope to master anything in the outer world. They must first conquer the inner one, and this is not achieved through some mystical shortcut. There is no royal road here. The lesson insists only patient, disciplined practice. The first practical technique introduced is called pratyahara, described as the art turning the mind inward upon itself rather than letting it constantly chase after outside stimulation. The lesson gives a wonderfully honest description of what actually happens when you first try this. Your untrained mind, given a chance, will leap around like an unchained monkey, refusing to settle until gradually, with repeated practice, it begins slowing down and looking to you for direction. Once that calm settles in, you gently turn your attention to the phrase, I am, picturing the I as independent of the body, deathless, invulnerable, and then gradually superior to the mind as well. The most advanced version of this exercise involves gradually shutting out every trace of outside impression, bodily sensation, and even ordinary thought, leaving only bare concentration on the phrase, I am not, I am this, or I am that. Simply, I am the pure statement of existence itself, focusing every scattered mental energy into a single point, producing, according to the lesson, a profound feeling of peace, strength, and power. The second technique is called dharana, or concentration. And the lesson is careful to clarify something that trips up a lot of beginners. Concentration is not the same thing as involuntary absorption or daydreaming. Someone who gets so lost in a task that they forget themselves entirely and neglect their responsibilities is not practicing true concentration, according to this teaching. They've simply become a slave to a habit. True concentration means a yogi can bury himself completely in a subject, extract every insight from it, and then pull his attention away at will, remaining the master of the process the entire time. Practical exercises follow. Take a simple object, like a pencil, and hold your attention on it, considering its size, color, material, origin, purpose, and history, exhausting every possible angle before moving on. Try concentrating on a single part of your body, deliberately shutting out sensation from everywhere else. None of these exercises matter for their own sake. The lesson reminds us a pencil is not important. What matters is training the mind to answer promptly and completely when it will give an order. This leads into an extended meditation on the importance of attention itself. Treat it almost as the visible face of the will. The lesson quotes a range of thinkers making essentially the same point from different angles. That attention is a foundation of nearly every meaningful human accomplishment, and that the difference between ordinary people and truly exceptional ones often comes down less to raw talent than to a trained capacity to hold focus steadily on something, especially something that doesn't naturally hold our interest on its own. Chapter 5, The Cultivation of Attention. The fifth lesson takes this theme of attention and goes even deeper into it, treating it almost as a discipline in its own right, deserving of dedicated practice. The lesson draws a distinction between two kinds of attention. Involuntary attention is the kind that gets pulled towards something bright, novel, or immediately pleasurable, without any effort on our part. Something even young children and animals possess in abundance. Voluntary attention, by contrast, requires real effort and training, the deliberate fixing of the mind on something that does not offer instant reward, purely because it was decided it matters. The second kind, the lesson insists, is rare, and it is exactly the kind that marks the difference between an ordinary mind and an extraordinary one. Here's a genuinely useful paradox the lesson highlights. We tend to assume that interest creates attention, that we pay attention to things because they're interesting, but the reverse is equally true and arguably more useful to know. Attention creates interest. If you deliberately hold your focus on something that seems dull at first, points of genuine interest will start revealing themselves the longer you look. The same way a plain-looking object under a magnifying glass suddenly reveals unexpected texture and detail. The lesson offers concrete exercises for training this faculty. Take a familiar object and try to observe every possible detail about it. Then write down everything you noticed. Then compare your list against the object itself to see what escaped your notice. Do this again the next day, and you'll find your list has grown, both because your memory strengthened and because your attention caught new details the second time around. Another exercise involves walking briefly through a room, then leaving and writing down everything you can recall having seen. The lesson tells the story of the famous French performer Houdin, who trained his powers of observation with his young son using a similar game, glancing quickly at shop windows and then comparing notes with his companion afterward, gradually building up an almost unbelievable capacity to recall detailed lists of objects from the briefest possible glance. Houdin trained his son further using a clever exercise with dominoes, showing him 2 dominoes at once and asking for the instant combined total of the spots, without allowing any counting, gradually working up to handling many dominoes simultaneously, until the boy developed remarkable powers of instantaneous perception that carried over into every other area of his thinking. The lesson takes real care to connect all this back to something bigger than mere party tricks. All of this attention training, it explains, is not really about pencils or dominoes or shop windows at all. It's about strengthening the underlying will, because attention stands quite literally at the gate of willpower. Sharpen the one, and you inevitably sharpen the other. Chapter 6, Cultivation of Perception. The 6th lesson takes the theme of attention and applies it specifically to the senses, and it opens by clarifying something worth remembering carefully. It is not the eyes or the ears that actually perceive anything. It is the mind. The senses are simply carriers, delivering vibrations from the outside world to the mind for examination, the way a messenger delivers a letter without reading its contents. Developing your perception, therefore, is really development of the mind itself, not merely a sharpening of the physical sense organs. There's an interesting bit of reasoning here about why the yogis, despite constantly warning against becoming enslaved to sensory pleasure, still actively cultivate sharper senses rather than dulling them. The lesson draws a clean distinction between having a keen, well-trained instrument and being a slave to that instrument. Nobody would seriously argue you should deliberately damage your eyesight to avoid becoming attached to beautiful things you might see. The goal is mastery, not deprivation. First asserting the I as ruler over the senses, and only then refining those senses to their fullest capacity, so that the ruled kingdom becomes larger and richer rather than smaller and poorer. The lesson takes us through each of the 5 senses in turn, and it's genuinely fascinating how much detail it goes into. Touch, the most primal and widely distributed sense, is discussed with actual measure examples. How a compass point applied to the tip of the tongue can distinguish separation at a far smaller distance than the same test applied to the skin of the back, showing how sensitivity varies dramatically across different parts of the body, depending on how much attention and use that area receives. Taste is described as closely related to touch, concentrated in the tongue. Smell operates through tiny particles carried on the air to the moist membranes inside the nose. Hearing, more complex than the previous 3, because it can register objects at a distance, works through vibrations in the air, ranging from the very lowest audible pitch up to the very highest. And sight, described as the most complex and far-reaching of all the senses, works through waves of light traveling at almost unimaginable speed, allowing us to perceive countless objects across vast distances in a single glance. The lesson then gives a set of general rules for developing perception more deliberately. The most important is this: Never try to take in a complex object all at once as an undivided whole. Break it down into its individual parts first. Examine each part carefully, and only then combine your observations into a complete, richly detailed picture. Try and perceive a person's face as one single blurry impression will leave you with almost nothing memorable. But if you deliberately study the eyes, then the nose and the mouth, then the outline of the face, one at a time, you'll end up with a vivid, lasting impression of the whole. This chapter closes with a wonderful, often told anecdote about the naturalist Louis Agassiz and a new student who came to him eager to begin serious scientific work. Agassiz handed the young man a preserved fish and simply told him to observe it, then left. The student, after a half hour, believed he had noticed everything worth noticing, but Agassiz did not return. Hours passed. The student grew bored, frustrated, even a little insulted, convinced his teacher had forgotten him or was simply old-fashioned and out of touch. Eventually, out of sheer restlessness, he began sketching the fish, and in the act of drawing it, discovered something he completely missed. The fish had no eyelids. When Agassiz finally returned and heard this single observation, he simply told the student to keep looking and left again. The exercise stretched across 3 full days, and by the end, the student had genuinely learned to see, developing a habit of careful, patient observation that stayed with him for the rest of his career, which he later called the single best lesson of his entire scientific education. Before we continue into the second half of this book, if you're finding value in walking through these old teachings piece by piece, this is a great moment to hit subscribe, because we got 6 more lessons ahead of us, and they take a genuinely fascinating turn into the deeper, hidden layers of the mind that most people never think to examine. Let's keep going. Chapter 7, The Unfoldment of Consciousness. The 7th lesson makes a real pivot in the material. Up until now, we've been talking mostly about the conscious mind, attention, perception, the intellect. Now the lesson wants to show us just how small a fraction of our total mental life consciousness actually represents. It opens by wrestling honestly with a genuinely difficult question. What exactly is consciousness? The lesson quotes various thinkers admitting that consciousness resists clean definition because we can only define things in terms of something else. And there is nothing else quite like consciousness to define it against. It's compared to trying to lift yourself up by your own bootstraps. The startling claim the lesson makes, backed by quotations from a range of scientific and philosophical writers of its era, is that only a small percentage of our total mental activity ever rises into conscious awareness at all. Some estimates cited put the figure as low as 10%. The rest churns away beneath the surface, unnoticed, doing enormous amounts of work we never directly witness. From here, the lesson traces an evolutionary path for consciousness itself, starting from the very simplest forms of matter. Even at the level of chemical reactions between atoms, the lesson claims, we can see the faintest, most rudimentary trace of something like sensation and response, an attraction or repulsion between particles that hints, however dimly, at the beginnings of what will eventually become full mental life. From there we move through crystals, through single-celled organisms, through plants, through simple animals, watching sensation gradually deepen and organize itself, gradually developing something recognizable as nervous systems, and, eventually, genuine awareness. The lesson then distinguishes between what it calls physical consciousness and mental consciousness, and the distinction is genuinely illuminating. An animal, even a fairly intelligent one, experiences the world directly. It feels cold, feels hunger, feels fear, but it cannot step back and reflect on the fact that it is feeling these things. It knows, but it does not know that it knows. A horse standing in the cold rain feels a discomfort just as a person would, but it cannot wonder when its owner will come let it inside, cannot feel sorry for itself, cannot compare a situation to other horses who might be warmer and drier. Human beings, once they develop mental consciousness, gain the ability to turn their attention inward, to reflect on their own experience as an object of thought, to say, I feel, I see, I desire, recognizing a self that stands behind and separate from each individual sensation. But this gift comes at a real cost. The lesson is honest about this. As mental consciousness deepens, so does a capacity for suffering. New wants arise that were never a problem before. Animals, largely free of this reflective capacity, tend to be content simply with enough food, safety, and companionship. Humans, capable of comparing themselves to others, imagining futures, dwelling on disappointments, often find themselves trapped in far more elaborate and persistent forms of unhappiness, even while gaining extraordinary intellectual and creative capacities in exchange. Beyond mental consciousness, the lesson describes a further stage called ego consciousness, which brings with a felt undeniable awareness of one's own reality, rooted directly in the absolute itself, a stage that, when it dawns, brings profound peace, because doubt, fear, and dissatisfaction simply fall away like worn-out clothing no longer needed. And beyond even that lies something the lesson calls cosmic consciousness, an experience reported across many different cultures and religious traditions throughout history, involving a direct, overwhelming perception of the underlying oneness and aliveness of the entire universe, usually arriving suddenly, lasting only a short while, and leaving behind a permanent, transformed sense of certainty even after the vivid experience itself has faded. The lesson offers a genuinely respectful explanation for why mystics and saints across so many different religious traditions have reported such wildly different descriptions of these peak experiences, despite what it argues is a shared underlying reality, because each person interpreting these overwhelming glimpses only had access to their own particular religious framework and vocabulary. They naturally describe what they experienced using the names and concepts already familiar to them, whether that meant the countenance of God, the face of Allah, or the vision of Buddha beneath the tree. The lesson suggests these are not necessarily conflicting reports of entirely different things, but rather differently dressed accounts of a genuinely shared underlying phenomenon, filtered through each observer's own cultural and religious lens. Chapter 8, The Highlands and Lowlands of Mind. Having established just how much of our mental life happens outside conscious awareness, the 8th lesson dives deeper into mapping that hidden territory, and it leans heavily on quotations from Western scientists and philosophers of the era to make its case, almost as if the author wanted to reassure skeptical Western readers that this was not merely exotic Eastern mysticism, but something increasingly recognized by rigorous modern thought as well. The image that anchors this whole chapter is borrowed from the physicist Oliver Lodge, comparing our conscious awareness to the visible portion of an iceberg, proudly gleaming above the waterline, while remaining almost entirely ignorant of the enormous submerged mass supporting it from below, or alternatively comparing us to the hull of a ship pushed blindly through dark water, entirely unaware of the deck, the sails, the captain, and the distant horizon above. Numerous thinkers are quoted describing their own direct experience of ideas arriving seemingly out of nowhere, fully formed, after periods of apparent inactivity. A mathematician discovers an important formula while out for a casual walk with his wife. feeling almost as though a circuit had suddenly closed inside his mind. A composer describes hearing entire pieces of music all at once as imagination, with the actual work of writing them down feeling like nothing more than transcription of something already complete. A scientist describes deliberately setting aside a difficult problem, trusting some hidden part of his mind to continue working on it regardless, only to have a solution present itself, fully worked out, days or weeks later, seemingly out of the blue. The lesson introduces a phrase, superconscious mind here, borrowed from a writer named Dr. Schofield, describing regions of the mind that lie above ordinary consciousness, associated with higher spiritual and creative faculties, existing in a kind of mirror relationship to the subconscious regions that lie below ordinary consciousness, associated instead with the automatic bodily and habitual functions. Between these two vast unseen regions sits the comparatively tiny, flickering candle flame of ordinary conscious awareness, illuminating only a small middle portion of the whole. Crucially, though, the lesson takes real care here to gently correct a mistake it saw many contemporary Western psychologists making. Excited by the sudden discovery that so much mental activity happens below conscious awareness, many of these writers lumped absolutely everything unconscious together into a single undifferentiated category, mixing the lowest animal instincts and irrational impulses together with the highest artistic inspiration and spiritual insight, as though they all came from the very same undifferentiated source. The lesson insists this is a serious oversimplification. Just as there are lower depths beneath consciousness, there are also higher heights above it, and the two should never be casually confused with one another, even though both happen to lie technically outside ordinary conscious awareness. Chapter 9, The Mental Planes. The 9th lesson takes this map of the mind and fills in the details with genuinely remarkable specificity, walking systematically from the very lowest mental plane all the way up to the very highest. At the bottom sits what the lesson calls the law of attraction, operating even among lifeless atoms and particles. A faint, primitive flicker of something like mental choice, responsible for the basic chemical combinations that build up all physical matter. Above that sits what the lesson calls the vegetative mind, responsible for the extraordinary, largely unconscious intelligence that builds a single fertilized cell into a complete living plant or a complete human body, drawing exactly the right materials from the surrounding environment and assembling them with precision that, the lesson notes almost with sense of wonder, our conscious intellect still cannot come close to replicating on purpose. This same vegetative mind, still active within every one of us right now, handles digestion, circulation, wound healing, and the constant, tireless replacement of worn-out cells, entirely without needing our conscious permission or even our conscious awareness. Above the vegetative mind sits the instinctive plane proper, responsible for hereditary impulses handed down across countless generations, reaching back through our human ancestors all the way into the animal kingdom. Here reside impulses like hunger, thirst, and the pull toward reproduction, alongside less flattering inheritances like jealousy, envy, and the urge toward aggression. The lesson is again careful and fair here, refusing to label any of this as simply bad. These impulses serve genuine, necessary purposes at earlier stages of development. The issue is never their mere existence, but whether a person has learned to master them or remains helplessly mastered by them instead. A related but distinct layer is what the lesson calls a habit mind, different from raw inherited instinct because it consists of patterns a person builds up themselves through repeated practice until those patterns sink below conscious awareness and begin running automatically. The lesson gives wonderfully relatable examples here. A pianist who once struggled desperately to control individual fingers eventually reaches a point where the fingers seem to play the music entirely on their own, freeing the conscious mind to focus purely on musical expression. A typist's fingers learn to find the correct keys without any conscious searching. Even something as basic as which arm you put into your coat first or which shoe you tie first each morning turns out to be governed by this same silent, automatic habit mind. And the lesson invites you to try reversing one of these tiny automatic routines just to feel firsthand how strangely uncomfortable and effortful it becomes. Above the habit mind sits the intellect proper, our familiar conscious reasoning faculty. Though the lesson reminds us that even a great deal of intellectual work happens below conscious awareness as well, in what it calls unconscious reasoning. Problems worked out by some hidden portion of the mind and only handed up to consciousness once the solution is fully formed. Above the intellect sits intuition, described as a genuinely different category of mental operation altogether, arriving as sudden, complete insight rather than step-by-step logical deduction. This is described as a wellspring of artistic genius, spiritual insight, and the deepest appreciation of beauty and love. The lesson brings in the old Greek concept of a personal demon, a guiding presence some especially creative or inspired individuals have felt watching over and directing their work, and reframes this ancient idea in modern terms as simply an unusually strong connection to this higher intuitive plane of one's own mind, rather than literally an external spirit guide. And at the very summit sits what the lesson calls cosmic knowing, the plane on which a person perceives directly, rather than merely believing intellectually, the underlying oneness of all existence, the same exalted territory described earlier in connection with the unfoldment of consciousness. The lesson closes this chapter with a genuinely moving quotation from a classic spiritual text called Light on the Path, describing the flower of the soul opening only in the deep silence that follows an inner storm, a silence that may last only a moment or stretch across 1,000 years, but which, once tasted, leaves behind a strength a person carries forward into every future battle. Chapter 10, Subconsciousing. The 10th lesson is where the book gets remarkably practical and hands-on, and it introduces a term the author actually coined specifically for this teaching, borrowing partly from a contemporary scientist's vocabulary. The word is subconsciousing, meaning the deliberate, intentional use of your own subconscious mind, directed by your conscious will, rather than simply hoping it will happen to help you by accident. The lesson points out that most people who benefit from their subconscious mind's problem-solving abilities have only ever stumbled into it accidentally. They cram their conscious mind full of information on some difficult subject, hope for the best, and occasionally get lucky when a solution surfaces days or weeks later, seemingly out of nowhere. But the yogi teachers, the lesson claims, train their students to direct the same faculty deliberately, the way you might assign a task to a capable assistant, rather than leaving the outcome entirely to chance. The method described works something like this. First, you gather your thought material about whatever problem you're working on, examining each piece with real interest and genuine attention, because attention is what gives raw thought the substance and shape needed for the subconscious mind to properly work with it later. The lesson uses several homely, memorable comparisons here. Boiling an egg until the runny white and yolk turns solid, working a shaving brush until thin lather thickens into a rich creamy mass, or churning cream into solid butter. In each case, attention transforms something vague and formless into something solid enough to actually be handled and worked with. Once you've gathered and thoroughly attended to your material, you form a clear mental picture dropping the whole bundle down through an imaginary trapdoor into your subconscious mind. issuing a firm, confident command. Something like, attend to this for me. Then, and this is the part many people find genuinely difficult, you deliberately let the matter go. You stop consciously worrying at it. Stop repeatedly digging it back up to check on its progress, the way an impatient child might keep pulling up a newly planted seed to check whether it's sprouted yet. Instead, you trust the process. Occupy your conscious mind with other things, and wait for subconscious mind to hand the finished, organized result back up to you in its own time, often after a period of sleep. The lesson offers plenty of real-world examples of people who had already discovered versions of this technique for themselves out of sheer practical necessity, without necessarily understanding the underlying principle. Skilled lawyers who can respond confidently and coherently to completely unexpected courtroom questions, buying themselves a few crucial seconds through some small physical habit, like slowly taking a puff of cigar or examining its ash, giving their subconscious mind just enough time to rapidly assemble a coherent answer before they need to speak. A teacher pausing thoughtfully before answering a student's question, appearing to think deeply, while in fact simply allowing a few seconds for the subconscious mind to do its rapid work behind the scenes. Crucially, the lesson draws a clear and important distinction between this deliberate subconsciousing process and the separate faculty of intuition discussed in the previous lesson. Subconsciousing is described as more like a faithful, patient servant, sorting, arranging, and analyzing material you have already gathered, without exercising any independent judgment of its own. Intuition, by contrast, is described as something more like a wise and trusted friend, capable of offering genuinely new insight and guidance that goes well beyond simply reorganizing what you already know. The lesson closes with an evocative image borrowed from old folk tales, comparing the subconscious faculty to helpful brownies who sneak in each night while a hard-working artisan sleeps, quietly finishing the rough work he prepared during the day. The crucial difference, the lesson reminds us, is that these particular helpers are not some separate external magic at all, but simply another part of your own mind, patiently waiting for you to learn how to properly ask for help. Chapter 11, Subconscious Character Building. The 11th lesson takes everything established so far and applies it to perhaps the most personally significant question of all. Can a person actually change their own character, not through grim, exhausting willpower alone, but by working intelligently with the same subconscious machinery already described? The lesson's answer is an emphatic yes, and its method centers on a single key concept, the mental image or ideal, rather than attacking an unwanted trait head-on through sheer repression, which the lesson considers an exhausting and often ineffective approach that fights against nature's own patterns rather than working with them. The recommended method is to cultivate the opposite, desire quality instead, allowing the positive trait to naturally crowd out and starve a negative one, the way a healthy plant given proper care will naturally overshadow the weeds around it. If a person struggles with fear, for instance, they are not instructed to sit and dwell intensely on their fear in an effort to destroy it. Instead, they are guided to focus their attention on cultivating courage, trusting that as courage grows and strengthens, the fear will naturally wither away on its own, because the lesson insists a positive quality will always eventually overpower its negative counterpart when given sufficient sustained attention. The lesson lays out a clear sequence for accomplishing this. First comes genuine desire. You must actually want to change badly enough to fuel sustained effort. And if that desire feels too weak at first, the lesson suggests you can deliberately cultivate it further. The same way desire for anything else grows stronger the longer you allow your mind to dwell on it, for better or for worse. The lesson is refreshingly honest that this cuts both ways. Exactly the same mental mechanism that can build up a noble desire for self-improvement can, if you're not careful, also build up a destructive craving for something harmful simply by dwelling on it repeatedly in your imagination. After desire comes faith, or what the lesson calls confident expectation. And it recommends beginners practice first on small, easy traits where success comes relatively easily, gradually building up genuine confidence before tackling harder, more deeply entrenched habits. Then comes the will itself, described here not as some clenched teeth, white-knuckle forcing of oneself, but as a calm, authoritative voice of the true, issuing its command from a place of genuine inner strength. With desire, faith, and will properly in place, the actual work begins, and the lesson identifies this work quite specifically as habit building. Character, the lesson argues persuasively, is really nothing more than an accumulated collection of habits, some inherited, some deliberately built. And the way to build a new habit is to first form a vivid, detailed mental picture of exactly the trait you want to possess, and then rehearse that mental picture repeatedly in your imagination, picturing yourself acting it out under a variety of realistic circumstances, the same way an actor rehearses a role privately before ever performing in front of an actual audience. Gradually, the lesson promises this private rehearsal begins expressing itself naturally in your real, everyday behavior until the newly cultivated trait becomes simply your natural, automatic way of being, requiring no more conscious effort than any other well-established habit. To make this concrete and actionable, the lesson walks through a detailed worked example, addressing a student struggling specifically with a lack of moral courage, self-confidence, and a persistent feeling of inferiority around other people. The preliminary thought offered is this: you and every other person you encounter come from precisely the same ultimate source, and in the deepest truth of things, you are genuinely equal to anyone you might meet, however impressive or intimidating they may appear on the surface. The lesson recommends memorizing and repeating a small set of carefully chosen words, each one understood deeply rather than recited mechanically. Words like courage, confidence, poise, firmness, and equality. And it recommends actively rehearsing in vivid imagination during quiet moments, scenarios where you successfully embody exactly these qualities, before gradually testing this new confidence out in small, low-stakes, real-world situations first, working your way up gradually to larger challenges as your practice confidence solidifies into genuine, natural strength. Chapter 12, Subconscious Influences. The final lesson turns outward, addressing the ways our minds interact with and influence one another, and it opens with a genuinely important caution. The author had clearly observed a lot of careless, even harmful misuse of these mental principles among certain contemporary thought power enthusiasts, people attempting selfish treatments on others without understanding or even caring about the consequences of what they were doing. The lesson is firm that this kind of manipulation eventually produces a serious backlash on the person attempting it. But here's the genuinely reassuring core message of this closing lesson. Nobody who has properly realized their own true I can actually be harmed by outside mental influence in the first place. A person resting securely in that realization becomes naturally surrounded by a kind of protective strength that simply repels hostile or negative thought directed toward them, sending it back toward wherever it originated, ideally serving as a corrective lesson to whoever sent it. For those still developing this realization, the lesson offers a simple, direct practice, standing tall, shoulders back, head raised, and firmly declaring something like, I deny the power of persons, circumstances, or things to adversely affect me. I assert my reality, power, and dominion over these things. The lesson insists there is no magic in the specific wording itself, only in a genuine felt conviction standing behind those words when you speak them. The lesson explains how we tend to attract thought patterns that match whatever we habitually entertain in our own minds through what it calls the law of attraction. Cultivate cheerful, optimistic thinking, and you'll find yourself drawn towards similarly cheerful influences from everyone and everything around you. Dwell instead in gloom or resentment, and you'll find yourself correspondingly drawn toward matching negative influences instead. Related to this is the simple, observable power of everyday suggestion. Spend enough time around gloomy people, and you risk unconsciously absorbing their gloom, just as spending time around cheerful, successful, energetic people tend to lift your own mood and outlook in turn. From here, the lesson moves into a genuinely striking discussion of what we might now call the power of positive expectation. It argues that a clearly held mental image of a desired outcome actively helps bring that outcome about, partly because a focused mind becomes far more alert to relevant opportunities it might otherwise have completely overlooked, and partly because sustained, confident mental images seem to mysteriously help arrange favorable circumstances around a person in ways that can feel almost too convenient to be pure coincidence. The lesson brings in observations from several outside writers making essentially the same point, that a clear, vivid, confidently held ideal, kept steadily in view, tends to draw remarkably favorable circumstances toward it, sometimes even converting what initially looked like obstacles into unexpected advantages instead. The book closes on a genuinely sweeping, almost prophetic note, reflecting on a particular historical moment in which it was originally written, a sense that humanity as a whole stood on the edge of enormous change, with old conventions, comfortable habits, and outdated assumptions all beginning to crack and give way under mounting internal pressure. The author compares this coming shift to the pain of childbirth, insisting that real transformation, whether personal or collective, is never entirely painless, but that the resulting peace on the other side makes the struggle entirely worthwhile. And the very last lines look forward, promising a follow-up course focused on what the author calls the yoga of wisdom, meant to explore even deeper truths about the underlying nature of reality itself. And that brings us to the end of the complete journey through Raja Yoga, what we've walked through together across all 12 lessons is really one continuous unfolding argument. It starts with the boldest possible claim that you are not your body and you are not even your mind, but something more fundamental standing behind both, an I that can be directly, personally realized rather than merely believed in secondhand. From there, the book widens that same I outward until it touches the whole of existence, then turns around and hands you concrete tools for taking command of your own attention, your own senses, your own emotional reactions, and finally the vast, largely invisible territory of your own subconscious mind, teaching you to direct it deliberately rather than leaving it to chance. And it ends by reminding you that none of this inner work is meant to stay sealed off in some private meditation chamber. It's meant to walk back out into your ordinary, everyday life, shaping your character, your resilience, and your relationship with everyone around you. Whether you take every single claim in this book literally, or whether you simply treat it as a remarkably rich, century-old toolkit for training attention, discipline, and self-command, there is genuinely something valuable here for anyone willing to actually practice it rather than just read about it once and set it aside. If this journey through Raja Yoga gave you something to think about, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because there are many more of these deep dives into classic, formative texts on their way. and I would love to have you along for the next one. Until then, rest firmly in the I, and I will see you in the next video.